right. Good morning, everybody. All right. Hey, that's actually pretty good. Well done. I'm honestly surprised Aaron didn't start today by talking about the Bengals game. You're going to let me share that? Okay. Because actually, if you just even want to have a great day today, you should go on Aaron's Facebook and look at this video that they recorded of their family reacting to that last-second field goal. It was phenomenal. There was just a lot of, I didn't know your voice could get that high, honestly, when screaming. It was great. But if I haven't met you yet, my name's Lane Gramling. I'm the Youth and Discipleship Director here at Summit. And I'm a diehard Colts fan. And so this feeling, this jubilation that you experience, I'm a little jealous of all of this because it's been, a decade since we've been had a good quarterback or anything. So, but I'm glad to join in the community of Cincinnati and celebrate with all of us with the Bengals and that kind of thing. But I just don't know what this winning feeling is like these days. But something that you should know about me is I have a spiritual gift of winning contests and drawings. So some of you might I don't know, that might just tune you out right away. I'm sorry, but for some reason, when I've entered contests and drawings and that kind of thing, for some reason my name often is the one that gets pulled. So the first time that this kind of happened was at a Colts game. So we have an Arby's that's in our town, and they had this experience called the Arby's High Five Kids experience. And so you can look at this picture up here, but I was one of 4 names that was drawn for this Colts game, and I got to go onto the field. They gave VIP passes to me, to both of my parents. I'm the second one over here, in case you can't tell. You might be asking, how did he get cuter between now and then? And it's just genetics. I don't understand, but sorry. But that was my first exclusive experience that I had ever had. And at the age of 11 or 12, that's one of those things where you kind of go and it's just overwhelming all the stuff that's there. If you've ever had something like that, like a VIP type experience, you have, a separate entrance. You get to go onto the field and have all of these things that happen to you exclusively to you because you are marked apart as something that's separate. And it wasn't because of how special I was, as much as my mom told me, but I had been chosen specifically to be set apart at that experience. And I got all of these memories and this experience because I had been chosen. And this concept of exclusion and set apartness is something that we're going to see in the character of God today. And in the character of God, we are set apart. We are marked differently. We are ready for a special use, kind of like this VIP experience. And if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 19, Exodus 19. And in this passage, we're going to see 3 different things. So if you're a note taker, 3 different things. We're going to see that God's true heart is revealed in covenant, in consecration, and in communion. So in covenant, consecration, and in communion. So if you flipped over there, Exodus is the second book of the Bible. So if you just open it to the very beginning, Genesis, flip through, Exodus is right there. Big number 19. And if you're just now joining us and you haven't been a part of this study with us, we're looking at the people of Israel, so this people that God has chosen and set apart as his own people. And they are now in the wilderness. They were in slavery in Egypt, and God has called them out of Egypt from slavery into this new found freedom. And we're just getting to see this experience that they have in this wilderness area. And as Aaron was sharing just a few minutes ago, in Exodus chapter 18, this last week, we saw that their leader, Moses, the man that God had called to be that mediator between God and man, was getting overwhelmed. And God brings up Jethro, his father-in-law, to say, hey, this is too much for you. You need to delegate. You need to take this feedback and not be the only one who's getting all this, but you need to be able to rest and to not just be super busy, but to include other people alongside with you as well. And that's where we get into Exodus chapter 19. And I'm going to start in verse 1 and just read the first few verses for us. And it says this. It says, on the 3rd new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, while Moses went up to God. So this passage in Exodus chapter 19 is really a dividing point in the book of Exodus. So if you have been with us over the last, however long we've been going through Exodus, it's talking about, so the Israelites did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. Like each chapter you can say, and this, and this. But if you notice, as this passage starts, it's this break right here. It gives this summary statement that says, on the third new moon after the people had gone out of the land of Egypt. So it marks this passage that something significant is about to happen because the author is summarizing all of this. And so when he says the third new moon, he's referring to, this is about 50 days after the Exodus from Egypt. So if you follow along in your Jewish festivals, this is when the time of Pentecost would be. This actually would be kind of the origins of the Feast of Pentecost, is this date right here, 50 days after they've gotten out of Egypt in the Passover. And this chapter 19 really provides a setting for the rest of what we're going to see in the book of Exodus, of the giving of the law. So in this passage, we're actually seeing a fulfillment of what God spoke to Moses in chapter 3. So in chapter 3 is the famous burning bush passage. And I'm going to read a couple verses from here. It says that Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So this name of the mountain Horeb is actually a name that's also used for Sinai. And it says this in verse 12. He said, "But I, being the Lord, will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." So this promise that God gave to Moses back in chapter 3. So before any of this Exodus, this Passover, all of these plagues, before any of that, God had promised to Moses that I'm going to bring your people out of this area, and I'm going to bring you right back to this very mountain. And in chapter 19, we are seeing the fulfillment of God keeping his promise to Moses with Israel. Moses has returned with Israel. And it says this, that the Lord called out to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you should say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I've done to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you should speak to the people of Israel." So the first thing that we see in this passage is this idea of covenant. Covenant. So throughout the Bible, there are several different major covenants that God makes with his people. So if you're kind of a theology geek like me, you know that there's probably about 5, 6, 7 covenants, depending on how significant you want to go with this idea of covenant. But you have Noah, is kind of the first person that God made some major covenant with, the Noahic covenant, if you want to sound really sophisticated. You have the Abrahamic covenant that God gives. This is oftentimes called the Mosaic covenant between him and Moses. See, if you add the IC, you just sound super scholarly, right? Later, you're going to see the Davidic covenant that God gives, and the last covenant that we see is called the New Covenant, the one that Jesus makes. Another word for covenant is also testament. So we have the Old Testament, all of the old covenants that God has given to his people. Then we have the New Testament, the new covenant that God has given to us today. And really what we're saying when God is starting to use this covenant language is God is about to reveal himself in not really a brand new way, but he's going to reveal himself in a new way to his people. Oftentimes in certain denominations, this is called a dispensation. And he does it in a style of a treaty. So what we even see in these verses 4 through 6 is there are two types of treaties that we see in the ancient Near East. There is a parity treaty. That's one type. So that's between two equal parties, a parity treaty. That, we make a ceasefire or something like that, or we'll do this, we'll trade this, and we'll come together in this way. Or there's a second type of treaty called a suzerain vassal treaty. Suzerain vassal treaty. You can Google that if you'd like. But what a suzerain vassal treaty is, it's between a greater and a lesser party. So oftentimes when there's this major influence in a region and they come and they start to conquer all of these nations, so if you think like Babylon, if you think Assyria, if you think Persia, they're often the greater party, and then they will make this covenant with a lesser party of some sort. That the greater is going to provide all these benefits of protection and that they're going to provide for these people. They're going to send rulers to these people. And the lesser party is going to provide like their finances, their taxes, their loyalty to serve the greater party. And that's what we're seeing in this passage. So there's even kind of 6 defining characteristics of a suzerain vassal treaty, and we're going to see all of these, not just chapter 19, but chapter 19 kind of going through the rest of Exodus. That there's a preamble that identifies who the suzerain is, whoever the ruling party is. There's a prologue that has the history between those two parties. There's the stipulations of the covenants. There's a periodic reading of the covenant. They're saying, okay, we're going to read this from time to time so our people remember this. There's a witness to the covenant, and there are also blessings and curses for keeping or if you fail this covenant. And so what really God is showing even in this book of Exodus, and as he starts to give this to the people, is that he is speaking in a language that is able to be understood. Is that even in this treaty that he's giving to his people, this is something that the Israelites would have been like, okay, cool, this is something that's in our language. So we're understanding that we are this lesser party, that God, you are the greater party. You are providing so much for us, and we will in turn provide our loyalty back to you. So we see 3 major parts in a covenant, okay? And these, I'll start with RE because, I'm going to be like super Baptist or something. So the first thing that we see is in these verses 4 through 6, we see redemption is the first thing that we see. So the first thing, and this is so significant, I think, in this covenant that God makes with his people, is that it outlines how God has already provided for his people. So this covenant is not based on you do this and then I'll do this. But notice what he says. It says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptian and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So before he gets into any sort of obedience or you're going to do this or anything like that, the first thing that we see is God talks about how he has already provided for his people. That he recounts the salvific work that he has done in the hearts of his people, that he has brought them out of Egypt into freedom. And now, out of this freedom is where we're going to see the next step. That he did it on eagle's wings, which commonly is like, it's done with great ease, with swiftness. Eagles are majestic creatures. And so that God has easily provided this great work of salvation for his people. Like, it didn't even cause him to sweat bringing Israel out of Egypt, this great power of the region. It was nothing for God to provide for his people. And so he gives this covenant to a redeemed people, not to redeemer people. That God gives his covenant, it's given to a redeemed people, not to redeem a people. And this is consistent with God's character. That when God gives his law, it is not just some arbitrary law, but he has given it out of a relationship that he already has with his people. That this gospel is something that's by grace through faith, as Ephesians 2 says, and then it leads to good works. The first thing that happens is God is in relationship with grace with his people, and then good works come out of that. And I don't want us to miss that difference. A lot of times we think that that requirement comes first. But what we see in God's character, like before God gives this big law, like the law to his people, it is out of a relationship of redemption, not the other way around. And I don't want us to miss that. It's not legalistic. So the second thing that we see, I just said a second ago, is requirement. So it's first redemption, and then God gives this requirement. He says, now, so therefore, notice that word again, therefore, because of this redemption, I'm going to give you a requirement. It says, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. That there's people that react to rules differently in different like I'm an Enneagram 1, and I have like this very defined sense of right and wrong that like if you tell me something, like I may or may not choose to believe it because I just have this innate sense of morality that's been given within me. And so like there's some times where I'm like, that rule's dumb. And so I'm going to follow this because I think this is a greater law. And I think some of us view law this way of like, it depends on who says it that really defines if I'm going to follow it or not. And that's really what this is even saying. So if I'm told to obey an arbitrary rule, there's kind of an instant distrust I have of it. Like if it says like don't walk on the grass, it's kind of like, do I really need to not walk on the grass there? But what makes that different is if it's given by a trusted person, because my motivation is then different. And God is saying that I'm giving these rules out of love, not just out of a sense of you have to do this. But there is a sense of that. That it says that if you obey, if you keep this, and again, I think why I'm prefacing this so much is there's going to be a lot of law in the next several weeks as we go through the book of Exodus. But this is where Christians oftentimes get tripped up because we have this in the wrong order, is that some of us, we fall on the side of legalism that say that if I obey all of these things, then God will love me, then God will care for me, then God will provide for me, then God will bless me, if I do all of these things. Then we have kind of the other side of this. Again, it's antinomianism is the fancy theological word that you can use, and that's that we have been redeemed, so there's no requirement whatsoever. And that's there's grace. I don't need to follow the law because God has already saved me, that Jesus died for me, so I don't need to follow anything. And both of these are false views of the gospel. Because what we ultimately need to do is we obey out of the requirement, out of the redemption that God has already given to his people. They both miss the grace that is given in obedience. But ultimately, the last thing that we see is we see redemption, we see requirement, and the last thing that we see is reward. We see reward in this passage. Like notice, it says that if you do this, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It says first that you're going to be a treasure, that Israel is going to have this unique relationship with God, not like any of the other people, but because I have redeemed you, because there's this sense of salvation that I have given to you, then you are going to be my treasure. I'm going to focus, and I'm going to see you as a rich reward. Also, you're going to be to me a kingdom of priests. And this is actually the first time that this phrase has been used in relating to God in the entire Bible. Is that God is saying, like, not only are you just going to be a people, but you are going to be a kingdom. That you're going to represent Yahweh, God, to the nations. 1 Peter picks up on this passage, and he says this, that, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. In verse 12, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on that day of visitation. It says that this is something that is given to us, that we have this mediator in the person of Jesus, and we actually are that royal priesthood that God is saying to Moses in Exodus chapter 19. Thomas Constable is a pastor and a theologian and a professor, and he says that a priest stands between God and people. Israel could become a nation of mediators standing between God and other nations, responsible for bringing them to God and God to them. Israel would not be a kingdom run by politicians, thank the Lord, depending on strength and wit, but, here's the key, one of priests depending on faith in Yahweh, a servant nation rather than a ruling nation. That the people of God are not just these like politicians going this way or that way, but they're people who are dependent on their faith in Yahweh. And out of that faith, then they get to show God to the world, and other people get to see God through them. And the last thing we see is this idea of holiness, that these people are going to be marked differently from other people in their devotion back to God and in the law as well. And that's what we're going to go in a minute with this. Now, the thing about this is God gives this beautiful blessing to his people. He says that if you keep my law, if you obey this, then I'm going to bless you in all of these ways. And it's just such a gracious moment where we get to see like God's abundance. But the thing is that Israel is never perfect in their obedience to the law. And so, even if you look through the rest of the Old Testament, even into the New Testament, is that Israel only ever gets a partial glimpse of this blessing because their obedience, even at its absolute best, was only partial to God. And, man, the last thing I want to say about these verses right here before we move on is I looked at a bunch of different commentaries and scholars as I was researching for this sermon, and time again, almost every researcher that I saw talked about verses 4 through 6 as the heart of the entire book of Exodus, and not even that, but the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. That these 3 verses right here shows the heart of God more than any other verse does, really in the entire first 5 books of the Bible. And when I think about that, there's some awe in that, because think about the other passages that are in the first 5 books of the Bible. You have creation, you have where he talks to Abraham, where he reveals himself. You have Jacob with the ladder before God. You have Joseph, and you have this incredible story of a guy rising to second in command of the most powerful nation in the world. And yet, scholars call this the most significant verses in the entire first 5 books of the Bible. So sorry, Aaron, I got this chapter. But because I think what it does is we get to see into the very heart of God through his covenant and with his people. And we get to see how God relates, that God is not this tyrant God. He's not this distant God, but God is one who ultimately is with his people, and he blesses them out of their obedience, which is rooted in this redemption that he's acquired for them. So if we move into verse 7, it says this. So Moses came, and he called the elders of the people and set before him all these words that the Lord had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So they confirmed their role as a nation that, yes, Moses, we confirm this covenant, we will obey, and we confirm again that Moses, that you are God's representative, that God is speaking through you in this moment, and we're going to do our end of the bargain. And even as we've already said, they way overestimated their ability to do this, that they really boasted in themselves in this moment because they're not really appreciating the fullness of God's holiness and the vastness of their sinfulness. And the rest of the Old Testament is going to describe over and over and over again how Israel attempts to follow the law and they completely squander every opportunity that's given to them. So then it says, and Moses reported the words of the people back to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud. The people may hear when I speak to you and also believe you forever. So he's preparing Moses to prepare the people that we're going to see this awe and this wonder surrounding the Lord in just a second. So when Moses told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So the first thing that we saw about God's character is this idea of covenant. The second thing that we see is consecration. It's consecration. And again, I love this alliteration thing. I was writing the text. It makes it really easy for me. So consecration is the second thing. And we see this idea that there are boundaries that have been set by God to keep people from coming up and touching the mountain. And you might think, wow, that sounds a little harsh, like people being put to death for coming up to see God. And as I was looking into this, I think what God is trying to communicate to Moses and ultimately to the people is this idea that God is not to be approached irreverently. I think that's the sin that we're seeing here, that if the people were to go up to the mountain and kind of gawk and look at it, that they would be irreverent in looking at the holiness and majesty of God. So it makes me think of, sometimes you're on 275 or another interstate and you have a bunch of traffic, and then you kind of get to where the edge of the traffic is and you expect to see, either some construction or like some police pulled over, and you kind of get to the end of it and you notice that the accident that's in front of you isn't even on your side of the interstate, but it's on the other side of the interstate, right? But it's because all these people have kind of slowed down to kind of gawk and look over the interstate at what's around there. Like, it's not really something that you kind of even know kind of innately, like, I'm not really supposed to be kind of looking over at that to see what's kind of going on. That's not really for me. That's kind of private. But it's just this innate sense that we have in us to kind of look over at that. And that's, I think, kind of what God is getting at in this passage, is that people, we have this innate curiosity to see things that we're not supposed to. like if you see a fire alarm somewhere, like my innate sense is, well, I want to pull that fire alarm. But maybe that's just me. Okay, I'm being kind of like transparent and vulnerable with you guys, and I feel a little hurt here. But if this place is holy, it must be approached with the highest respect and awe. And that's what we're seeing from the people. And honestly, I think it's a little humbling for us too. Because I think a lot of times when we approach God, like obviously we have the covenant of grace today, but we need to be able to see God as this holy God that he is revealing himself as. Like, when was the last time that you approached God like this? That God is ultimately holy and that he is worthy of our fear. When have you acknowledged God's holiness in your life? That God is not just this daddy God that we can come to and this teddy bear. That he's loving, he is, but he is also worthy of our fear. So we see these boundaries set. We also see this washing of garments, right? That this idea is that holiness actually involves cleanliness. And like, note what I did not say is cleanliness is next to godliness. That is not in the Bible, in case you're wondering. But I think there's a truth that he's saying here is that oftentimes our spiritual reality is reflected in our spiritual reality. Is a lot of times what we do physically actually shows what's actually happening spiritually in our lives. And what he's doing is this clean linens here, they are an outer reflection of what should be going on in the hearts of the Israelites. Is that if they want to be clean, if they want to appear even somewhat righteous before God, they need to have this sense of being clean. That's what God is saying to his people here, is that you need to be, if you're even going to approach not even my presence, but even the outside of my presence, you need to have this cleanliness because you're not worthy to approach my fullness. So it says this. It says, so Moses went down from the mountain to the people, and he consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, well, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. So even like good things are put to a pause. They're halted to concentrate on this occasion. And I think what he's saying is that, God, I am so holy that even like your best isn't worthy of coming before me. And so even like something as good as marriage, like this is not something that you need to approach because that's going to take your focus off of what's most important. And I think for us, so many of us that are married in this room, like marriage is a good gift from God. But when we're married, we have to fight for holiness. Because we can get super concentrated on what's going on horizontally. It takes away sometimes from that vertical focus. And we have to fight for that. We have to make time for that. So even if you're single in this room, this is an opportunity that you have to be fully devoted to the Lord. You don't have that, I'm going to call it a distraction, okay? You don't have that distraction horizontally. So this is an opportunity that whether it is a seasonal thing, whether it is a lifetime thing, that this is something that you get to pursue with your entire heart. So go for it. This is an opportunity that you don't want to miss, that God has given you a privilege. So if we keep reading, it says this. Verse 16, on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all of the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. Like imagine this picture that we're seeing. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke. Like I'm almost imagining like Interstellar, that music of that loud drone sound, that trumpet growing louder and louder. Moses speaks, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So again, we're seeing this fire image. So Moses, again, in chapter 3, God appears to him in what? Burning bush. Okay, 3 of you that are with me, sweet. So I work with students. I need this kind of call and response just to make sure that we're still here, you know. But he appears to him in a burning bush, right? This idea of fire. And once again, on the same mountain, he's appearing once again in fire. And we're getting we're getting this small glimpse into this awesome scene. And I think this is often a word that is just like, it's lost its meaning. You know, we call so many things awesome. Like the Bengals winning, that was awesome. Like my wife, that's awesome. That's awesome. This is that awesome. But I think what we're seeing is an awesome moment here. That this is something that fills you with awe and wonder. Like the closest thing that I can even think of is when I saw the Grand Canyon for the first time. Is that if you've been there, that you've seen, like you walk to the edge of this wilderness, this vast beyond, and you just think, wow, I am so small compared to this vastness in front of me. This is so beautiful, and I cannot even comprehend this. And I think that's like 0.00001 of what the Israelites are experiencing of God in this moment. That there's thunder, there's lightning, there's this trumpet blast, and the response of the people is trembling. Like this, it invokes this again, the spiritual thing invokes this physical reality where they're even in fear of this God that's in front of them because they realize, oh shoot, this thing, this God, this person is awesome. Like it makes me think of Isaiah 6, where Isaiah gets to go before the Lord, and his response is, woe is me, I am lost before the glory of the Lord. That there's a realization of God's impending presence and the dangers that are associated with God's presence. Like, I think sometimes that we even say like, hey, show us your glory. And really, even at our best, we can only see a fraction of God's full glory. Because to see God's full glory is to melt away in his presence. That we can't even stand in God's presence. And I think the Western church, that us kind of over here, we have kind of lost this idea of God that is to be feared. And we've replaced him with a pacified version of that. Like it makes me think of that famous passage in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which says, talking about Aslan, so this picture, this metaphor for God, that Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Ooh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I think that's the picture that we're getting of this. He's not necessarily safe, but he is good, so we can trust him. And so what we see here is we see this ceremony that then takes place. And this is a third thing, is that we saw consecration. Now we see communion between God and his people. That yet, even in this awesome power, in this thunder, this lightning, we see God come down to his people to commune and be in a relationship with them. Like, how cool is that? That even in God's gloriousness, he comes down and he talks to Moses. That Moses brought the people here to meet God. Not to just view him from a distance, but to meet the creator and the sustainer of the universe. This is not some distant power, not some ethereal, like up there type God, but this is a God who has come to his people, and we have Emmanuel, God with us. And that's what we get to see. Is that, again, God is consistent in his character. That Jesus is just this consistent thing that God has been saying since the very beginning, that I have come to be with my people, to dwell with them forever and ever. And we see God in his glory coming to his people to commune with them. Again, if we keep reading, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to the Lord, to look and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come to Mount Sinai, for you yourselves warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come to the Lord, lest he breaks out against them. So Moses, again, went down to the people, and he told them. Again, so he's reiterating this warning from earlier. And I think what we're seeing in this passage is, again, something about the character of God. And is that God is different from us, and that he must not be approached lightly. I think that's what we're seeing. And that God also must be approached on his terms and not our own terms. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. that because he is God and we are not. And so he is that greater power. We are that lesser power. And so we come to God on his terms, not on our own terms. Matthew Henry says this. He says, in divine things, we must not covet to know more than God would have us know. And he has allowed us as much as is good for us. That a lot of times I think we want to get into God's head and be like, God, man, I only wish I knew that. I only wish I knew that. And even some of the songs that we sing, like, God, show us your glory. Show us your glory. We want to see more of you. And I want to say, we might not want to see more of God because he is holy. He is mighty. And he must not be approached lightly. And again, we're seeing this theme of exclusion still present in this. There's a set apartness that we're seeing in this. That God is saying, like, I am God. I am this set apart being. And so you cannot come to me on your own terms. You have to come to me, you have to come to me in holiness, and you have to come to me in set apartness. So maybe for some of us, we just haven't approached God in a holy manner sometimes. And we need to think through, when I come to God in prayer, that's a lot of times why I love to start my prayer, not by just asking God for things, but I love to start prayer by simply telling God who he is. Because a lot of times when I do that, it begins to reorient my mind to start thinking through, okay, God is not just this guy who just gives me everything, but God is sovereign. He is mighty. He is in control. And so when I pray that back to God, and I say, God, you are sovereign, you are holy, that starts to shift even what I'm about to say in a second later in my prayer, because I have reoriented my heart to face God, to realize who he is. So then I'll respond in that way. So this whole experience that we see right here, and honestly going on through the book of Exodus, and I don't think I caught this until kind of late in my study, but this whole experience is set up in the style of a wedding. A Jewish wedding. So look at this with me. Is that the first thing that we see God do is we have this whole concept of engagement, that God promises his people. He gives this promise. Out of this relationship that he already has, he promises, here is who I'm going to be to you. Then we have this season of waiting, of consecration, where the groom has gone away and the bride is preparing herself for the day when God comes to commune. Then we see this arrival, and in a Jewish ceremony, when the groom comes from preparing this place for his people, it is sounded with a trumpet blast, that there are people calling ahead saying, the groom is coming, get yourself ready, be prepared. And then when the ceremony starts, that they often gather under this covering, and we see God with his mighty cloud that covers the mountain, ready for the ceremony that's about ready to take place. And ultimately, then we get to see this idea of communion, where God gets to come to his people. And then here's the really interesting thing for me. And I don't get to touch on this. This is going to be for next week. But oftentimes in the wedding ceremony, there is a gift that's given from the groom to a bride, some sort of price that he pays for this ceremony. And what comes next in the book of Exodus? We have the law of God. So if we start to review this through the idea of a Jewish wedding ceremony, we now start to shift even the way that we get to see the whole law of God, the 10 Commandments. That now we get to see is that God is presenting himself as a groom for his bride. And then he's giving this gift, the best gift that he could possibly imagine he gives is his law to his people. This is his love letter, is his law to his people. And what we get to see in the person of Jesus is we see a groom who would then lay down his life for his bride, the church. That Jesus ultimately inaugurated this new covenant for us. That we are now in this season of consecration, waiting for Jesus, the groom, to return for us. And we're waiting and we are preparing ourselves. We are being sanctified for this day when Jesus returns to experience communion with his people forever and ever. Like, what a cool picture we get to see in Exodus 19. Like, this is the God that we get to serve. This is the heart of Yahweh. A God who comes to commune with his people, one that he loves so much that he was willing to lay down his life on a cross for us, that he paid the price for the sin that is in every single person right here in this room. And if you have not trusted Jesus, man, how I could beckon you to come to him because he is worthy. Like, we are not worthy of the love that God gives us, that God is holy. And I think each of us at different points in our life have experienced this moment where we have seen this holiness of God and we realize that we are not holy on our own, that God alone is holy, that we are sinful, and we cannot make our way back to God on our own. But God chose us. He chose you if you will put your faith in him. And he says that I will lay down my life for you, so that way you can experience communion with me. And that then turns into this covenant of where we get to then graciously obey him and walk in the good works that he has prepared in advance for us to do. So the book of Hebrews then picks up on this entire experience through the lens of Jesus and the new covenant. So you can turn here or not, but this is where we're going to land the plane, is that Hebrews 12, verses 18 through 24 says this. It says, For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and a darkness and a gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further message be spoken to them. For they, the Israelites, they could not endure the order that was given. It says, if even a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. And look at this. It says, but you have come not to Mount Sinai, but to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the innumerable angels in festal gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So rather than having to come to Mount Sinai, we have come to a new and better covenant at Mount Zion, the new city, the new Jerusalem that God is restoring at the end of all things. And rather than fear, we have forgiveness at Zion. Rather than the dry desert that they experienced in the wilderness, we have a city of a living God with flowing rivers. Rather than exclusion, we have an invitation to experience God. Rather than law, we are under the covenant of grace. Rather than guilt, we have been justly made righteous through the blood of Jesus. And rather than having Moses as a mediator between God and man, we have Jesus as the one and true mediator between God and man. So we do not have to approach God in the same way that the Israelites do, but we have a new, a better covenant through the person of Jesus at Mount Zion. So it goes on for a little bit, but I'm going to skip down to verse 28 and says, Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. That our response to this person of God, this consuming, like think about a picture of a consuming fire. It takes everything that's around it and consumes it. It takes it up. And our response to a God who is like this is acceptable worship. And Romans 12 would tell us that this acceptable worship that we present to God is actually a living sacrifice of our entire lives, that we don't have to put a lamb or a ram on an altar, but the actual sacrifice that we get to offer is a sacrifice of praise with our lips back to God. And as we take a look at this idea of who God is, as we have explored the vastness of God's character, his holiness, his heart for his people, that just leads us to experience worship. Because true worship acknowledges the true worthship of God. True worship acknowledges the true worthship of God. That, like, we use this, again, this word glory. And glory is a synonym for the word weight. Is that we have to give something weight. And when we give something glory, when we give worship to something, we acknowledge the weight that it already possesses. And so, even as we kind of come to a close this morning, I want us to even just take a second and pause and realize the character of our God, who is so vast, so incomprehensible, and yet he comes to commune with his people. As the old hymn goes, when he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne. Jesus, we love you.